another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and along with me is my co-host, Brother Derek Williams. This is the third section of a series of talks that we are doing. It's a kind of a parallel discussion. On one half, we're talking about a book that we both read. This is the audio version of it, which I prefer, and Brother Williams also prefer, and it's based on about 12 speeches done by Martin Luther King. And why Martin Luther King? I don't know if he would be considered African-centered, but I think he would be if you want to define it, you know, because he was definitely centered within our community. But we also parallel that by critical thinking, because we feel that critical thought is a very powerful and important tool to use, especially in today's multimedia, computerized world that we live in, because we are bombarded with a lot of information. But information by itself has no meaning unless you can put it in the proper context. And you have to be able to, and also that truth, all truth is hidden beneath the surface. That's why, as Malcolm said, we require research and study. Yes. And you know, and knowledge required knowing, and knowing require study. And many of us do not do that within our African American community, so critical thought. And Martin is a good example of a critical thinker, because a lot of the things that he say in his speeches that a lot of times we haven't really heard. We might hear I have a dream but have anybody really remember what he said about Vietnam, for example, and how he analyzed. He was criticized for protesting against the Vietnam War. But a lot of things that he says in his speech back in 1967 can be applied to what's going on today in our current situation with Iraq and what's happening out there in the Middle East. It's overseas, our forces are being utilized, but on the side of right, justice, truth, or again, are we being manipulated by the system for another unknown or secret agendas? And he brought that point out in one of his speeches when he talked about Vietnam, and he actually used history and a lot of different points that make you want to say, sounds familiar, you know? You heard that speech, and how did you feel about?
Well, like you said, as a critical thinker, and it's interesting that the picture on the box there of tapes shows him probably doing just that, critical thinking. I think he probably did that whenever he was not asleep. He was critically thinking about things. I wish there were some special imagery we could put on the screen right now. When you ask those questions, I wish it could have been edited into the video, a big question mark, you know, at that point, because I think that question mark represents for me critical thinking. And when Martin first began to speak out, of course, he was criticized. He was criticized by people within his own circle. Yeah. And he was criticized by those national leaders and governmental officials. Somehow people did not see civil rights and the war in Vietnam as being, having a connectiveness. And yet, in the critical thought process, you immediately see that they are connected. And Martin even said, you know, he recognized that, you know, many of you all have seen me coming into a different area here. And he gave 7 reasons, and I can't mention all 7, but I can tell you that one of the reasons why he saw a need to begin addressing the injustice of the war was that young African Americans were being sent to Vietnam disproportionately to our numbers, and not even having the freedoms that we were supposedly fighting in Vietnam. That was one reason.
And another point on top of that was that we were fighting along white Americans, you know,
who in America
would not even be
Would
in the
not even be
same
together.
because of segregation.
That's right.
So it was a point that he brought about. Also, he said that a lot of the gains or programs that were starting to come about, again, the money that was spent per day to fight that unjust war, as he
Being
saw it,
ciphered.
was given a reason. Like, and we could say the same thing for a lot of the programs. A lot of the states are having problems today because a lot of the federal monies are not getting appropriated to it. So there's similarities to what was going on and the rationale against the war in Vietnam, and some of the policies that are being generated today as we go into the 21st century and the reshaping of that world. You know, I think Jesse Jackson said one time that it's all right to see a black male reach for a gun if he's going out to fight for America. But it's not all right for a black male to reach out for America's benefits.
Yes.
We're told that what's wrong with it, either it's criminal or something's wrong with that, or you got to do it on your own, do your own thing. You know, so we're talking about reaching out for what is justified in the American Constitution, in the tax laws. Are we benefiting from those things? We're fighting wars and policies now that personally I find questionable, as was back there in Nam. You know, there was a lot of things that are coming out now that we were basically lied to.
Well,
I
think any war should be, first of all, questionable, okay? And I think that was one of the points that Malcolm was Martin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, let me say, this Freudian slip that I keep sliding into, Martin and Malcolm,
Yeah.
it's interesting because both individuals were national heroes that in my growing up process, saw attributes in. And so I'm not crazy when you see me do that. And so I ask you to correct if I say Malcolm when I mean Martin.
Well,
so
I
say that to the listening audience as well.
And the reason I, sometimes don't say anything because I too, after a point and after studying, realized that they were coming more closer together. A lot of times, again, the media and those who do not know us try to manipulate an image that Martin was over here and Malcolm was over here. He was violent. He was a peace lover. It was nothing like that.
So often, yes.
Malcolm never shot anybody, killed anybody, or even said about rioting. Nothing. He was a minister himself.
Yes, and he was basically saying, I have the right to protect myself. If you come to destroy me,
Recognize,
that
First
I
Amendment.
will be there to meet you.
NRA says that, right?
Well, not only does NRA say it, but when you look at what is happening today, when you look at the war in Vietnam, we can spin off from that, Smokey.
Yeah.
The war in Vietnam used violence to declare a policy that
To push their interests, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Martin said that in his speech. He said that because he had a little disagreement with those who were pushing, like I said, there was a lot of riots going on during that period of time. There were a lot of young black men who were going over the seas and coming back and not getting jobs and were angry. And he said, they had a point.
Yes.
Because
Yes,
he was
did
saying,
say
they're listening to him saying nonviolence and all this, and it was during the time in '67 when he made this speech, when you had the Watts riots, you had Jersey was going up, Cincinnati, all over the country, people were just blowing up. And he said, well, they made a point because they said, look at the government.
That's right.
It's over in Vietnam using violence to get their interests in place.
Yes. Yes.
And we're just doing the exact same thing.
He did recognize that, and because of his critical thinking, he even declared that it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He was calling for that very group of young men to be nonviolent, when in fact they had, as you said, been sent to a country to be violent. And he saw that as America's policy to be violent, and yet he was the antithesis of this whole concept. A tremendous amount of burden and responsibility to try and convince a nation when every day they see that nation feeding off of its own violence.
And also a point that a lot of people never considered. He recognized that for America's sake, the image that it was pushing out in its quest to fight so-called communism.
On the international scene, yes.
Yes, that he reminded America that it represented dissent.
Yes, he did.
It represented revolution.
Yes, he did.
Because the foundation of America
Yes.
was against an empire.
Yes, Smokey.
Was against a dominant, controlling. People don't understand that colonial powers, the fundamental rationale behind a colony is exploitation.
Absolutely.
You don't have you have a colony to exploit its resources.
That's right. Take the resources out and basically enslave
America
the people.
was a colony to Britain.
Yes.
All right? Americans who were there, the so-called founding fathers, realized they were being exploited.
Yes.
The tea, the taxes, and no representation.
Yes.
And many of the countries during the 50s in Africa, in South America, in the Middle East and Far East were looking at America's history of dissent and saying, we want the same thing, because most of those countries were under colonial power.
Yes.
Britain, France,
Yes.
Belgium, all these European colonies,
Yes.
over 100 years or more. Especially
Yes.
like in Africa and stuff like that. We still have dealing with that.
Well, even after World War II, the meeting of the European groups to chop up the world and decide who was going to rule who. Getting back to Vietnam, if you remember, Smokey, Vietnam had been occupied by a dual power.
Yeah.
Both the Japanese and the French.
Yeah.
And the Vietnamese basically were an American revolutionary group in terms of conceptually.
They saw America, in fact, their constitution in 1945, Ho Chi Minh took a lot of the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution and said all men, the preamble basically.
A lot of people
Vietnam,
don't know that.
we're
A lot of people don't
incorporated.
want to advocate that either.
And instead of America going and propping up a country that is doing the same thing they did 200 years earlier,
Yes.
in 1776, they sided with the colonial power. And Martin said, hey, you are becoming the antithesis of what you say you represent.
Yes. Yes.
All these countries, he said revolutionary thoughts and revolutionary ideas were good. They had to get out of the yoke of colonial oppression, because the world would never, you said we'd be marching and demonstrating and in an uproar for generations and generations as long as we stand on the necks of all these emerging countries.
Well, it was the birth of a nation, and Smokey, so often I think America's prescriptions are okay when they apply to America, but when they apply to other people, and this is the obvious nature of our contradiction, and
Exactly.
it amazes me. It amazes me how so much of this information is basic to our falling over our own feet, and yet with each epic era we repeat the same faux pas, the same mistakes. I mean, this little small country, Vietnam, had been so abused by the Japanese and the French.
And they want their freedom. That's
The
all they
natural
want.
resources, the taking of their land, the abuse of the people.
And our propping up of a regime, Diem, which was the regime that we put into place after the French lost interest in Vietnam in the early 50s.
Well, you got to remember this too. Not only did they lose interest,
They
but they told us
not even get involved.
not get involved.
Because they got their butt
These
kicked.
people are fighting for. They recognize their own era, but because it was such a rich piece of land, real estate, and the fact that there were so many corporations in America that had their hands in Vietnam, so many.
Yeah.
And I won't mention all of them, but they were there. That was the true reason. It had diddly squat to do with the domino
communism,
theory
communism,
of if this country falls.
But does it sound kind of similar to what we're hearing about terrorism today? And
It's the same
how
thing.
that is being used to manipulate certain policies that are
Same.
going out, and we're pushing our empirical dogmas all over the planet.
Same thing.
We haven't learned the lessons.
Same
That's the
thing.
parallel we're seeing with
Same thing.
Vietnam.
Same thing.
Because Martin said that if we do not get our foot off and allow people true freedom, the same freedom we claim that we represent,
Yes.
how could you represent it and act in a colonial way?
Yes. Martin did say that. And because of his spiritual commitment to world order, to a spiritual world order of loving your brother and sister, he also reminded us that the Vietnamese were our brothers and sisters, as with all other people on the universe that are fighting for the right to be free.
And that's what he was trying to say. And he recognized as long as we deny that freedom, we are going to be marching against some kind of abuse. Aren't we doing it now with the people, all the marches and demonstrations have been done against the war in Iraq? He predicted that we'd become Guatemala, all the things that happened in Central and South America, Colombia, all these things. He even predicted back then we'll be constantly at odds
Yes,
with
he
our
did.
government,
Yes, he did.
who are putting policies that any spiritual person knows go against and
Smoky.
violate
Yes.
your freedom.
Yes.
How can we say freedom and we're not allowing the people to be free? We want them to be free based on how we want to shape them.
That's the contradiction. And even Myrtle Gunner in the 40s, a Swedish sociologist, when he came to this country and he looked at America through a critical eye, I mean, at that time, he said America's problem is America's problem with race. America's problem is that America has not yet addressed the two separate societies.
We have two Americas.
Two Americas.
We always had that.
And our political international policy is one of our problems too.
Yeah.
When we allow the corporations, the Chiquita bananas, the oil rich companies to come into countries and not only dictate their policies, but to determine the meager wages that these people are paid, the production of a tennis shoe for $3.50 and the selling of that tennis shoe for $125 and paying these people 25 cents a day.
Wages.
Is that worse? Is that worse than communism?
Exactly.
Is it worse than totalitarianism? Is it worse than dictatorship?
And then telling that those people have the right to vote.
Yes.
Vote what? Another elite who's going to benefit, who owns the factory?
And these are the kinds of injustices, Smokey,
That breeds
you
this
know,
kind of
people
problem.
ask the question, why do they hate Americans? You know, the typical American that walks the street and trying to make ends meet, trying to pay your house note,
Exactly.
trying to pay your water bill, your electricity bill, that typical American that goes to the media, turns the television on, and gets an explanation from someone who has decided that the only way to correct this situation is through war, you know, you're too busy. And what happens is that we follow into the fellowship track. We learn not to be, to dissent. We learn not to ask those critical questions. And if someone comes along with a different point of view, what do we call them? You're anti-American.
Anti-American.
You don't support the war.
Do
you support your troops? Yes, when you must support the war. Is that critical thinking?
No.
And I'll save that for the next program. But I think Martin was trying to get us, Smokey, to respond and to understand
he was
our behavior on a world
He
stage.
wanted to address humanity, and he saw that if we don't, as a human species, start working together, we're going down a path of destruction.
Nuclear destruction.
Yeah, and we still have that threat today. This ain't happening. I mean, people didn't wake up one morning and say, you know, I'm just going to blow up things in America.
Yes.
Because, you know, nothing else to do.
No, it just didn't come out.
I'm just evil, and I'm an evil person. People have a perception.
Yes.
And those perceptions, no matter how radical or drastic it is, came from somewhere.
That's right.
And we got to understand that truth.
Yes.
You know, whether you were in a sweatshop in the east side of some ghetto in America or barrio in America,
yes.
you know, that generates gangs who
Yes.
look at why me? I don't care.
Yes.
This is my turf.
Yes.
Or you in a shtetl in some Jewish community in Germany somewhere, or are you in Palestine in one of their camps?
Yes.
It's going to generate that kind of, and until we human beings, voting is not going to get you that.
Yes.
We're going to have to look at the human aspect, and that's what Martin was about. And that's what he was talking about. Until we see each other as human beings, we're going to have war after war. And those who are in power are going to get caught up in this roller coaster ride because they're not looking at the masses of the people, they're collateral damage.
Yes.
They're looking at their own personal interests
Yes.
and claiming that it is the interest of the everyday person.
Yes.
And they're using our troops, our young men and women,
Yes.
as tools.
Yes.
See, I have nothing against the tool when they say that. It's how that tool is being utilized.
Yes. Yes.
And the amount of money we're spending to bomb people, we dropped more bombs in Vietnam than they did in all of World War II and I think, combined.
Yes.
On that landmass, it wasn't, I don't know how big Vietnam was, but it wasn't that big.
It wasn't very big. Over 1 million people killed, mostly men, women and children. And not to mention the bombing in Cambodia and the surrounding
Laos,
areas,
yeah.
Laos. It was a war. It was a war that cost us 50,000. And look at the ratio. And I lost friends in the war.
Too.
But look at the ratio of 50,000 to over 1 million. And I'm not talking about one deed justifying another, but I'm talking about the fact that the war did not accomplish any of the things that we said that the war was to accomplish. No more than I believe this so-called war today is going to accomplish any more than the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam, in the 1970s, I think 1971, there was, in the New York Times, there was a paper that came out. It was called the Pentagon Paper.
Oh, yes.
And it was commissioned by Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time under Kennedy.
Yes.
And it was done by the Rand Corporation, which was a think tank.
Yes.
And the actual name of the paper wasn't the Pentagon Paper. That was the nice twist they put on by the newspaper that came out.
Yes,
but it was called The Decision-Making History of the Vietnam War from the early 1950s on.
All the way up to.
And it was found that we were lied to.
Yes.
If the Pentagon Papers, you could get it right on the it's like thousands and thousands of pages.
Yes.
You could get on the internet right now. I downloaded a whole copy. It's like that thick.
Yes.
And it talks about, like, for example, the reason we went into Vietnam and our first set of troops was gone is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Oh, yes.
In 1965, when President Johnson said that because of some Vietnamese boats came out into international waters
That fired on.
and
yes.
fired on a destroyer
American
called the Maddox.
Yes.
But it was found out in the Pentagon Papers that no, they were not in. They were in Vietnam, northern Vietnam waters, and the
sovereign nation.
The sovereign nation,
Yes.
and the justification, the Tonkin letter was written before that incident.
Yes.
They just attached that incident to that. They found that incident as a rationale to do that, and our troops we started sending troops based on that. It was lies.
My goodness.
Okay, and this was found out. So we started escalating from 1965 for another 10 years. And this is what Martin was talking about. From 65 to 75, when the last helicopter came on there, we were fighting wars, and all those young men and women were dying based on a lie.
Yes. Yes.
And we got ourselves into that. We had promised the Vietnamese people free elections in 1954. Until that time, when they were supposed to have, I guess they told the Palestinians that they got their little points, for their state. Same thing was told to the Vietnamese,
yes.
Back then. And Ho Chi Minh said, okay, I'll wait.
And yet, Smokey, with the revelation of that historical fact, we Americans, especially those who may have heard that for the first time, if that doesn't activate you to see that
Critical
so much
thinking.
of what has been told to us has been altered, has been shaped, has been based on a lie. I mean, look at the thousands of lives that were lost as a result of that, and the millions of lives that were lost in Vietnam.
And the economic wealth that was spent on that war that could have been used for the more domestic problems.
And that's what Martin, that was one of the points that Martin was making, that yes, civil rights was connected to the war because the monies that were being spent
Allocated,
in
yeah.
funding that war were monies that were taken out of building not only a great society, but meeting some of the fundamental prerequisites of living in America.
Because Johnson had a vision of the poor. That was a great society thing, right?
Yes.
But he couldn't, he was so caught up with this Vietnam mess
Back and forth.
in 67, 68.
Yes.
That's why he didn't run again.
Yes, yes.
Because he saw, every day he looked at all those dead young men and women that were coming across his
Yes.
desk. He thought that he knew the lie that he made.
He had a call to conscience. That's what happened.
Yeah,
He had a
yeah.
call to conscience. That's why the man could not serve again.
Yeah, and we can't, and don't think that we haven't gotten away from that, because we have to question what our government is doing.
It
We
is
have to
your
question-
duties, Smokey, as a citizen to question it. It is your duty to question it. And if you find yourself going along with the status quo without turning over the coin, and remember there are two parts to every coin, the head and the tail. As a matter of fact, you can get super critical and add another third part, the rim.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the angle that you look at that coin, you will see many other features. And if Martin taught us nothing else but to be able to question and to see that we have the right as Americans, not to see yourself detached, some nebulous little figurines that just happen to be occupying space and time and breathing oxygen.
Yeah.
Martin gave us that right to ask those kinds of questions.
I know that's why we call this series of talks a call to conscience, because we talked about Martin because he's a good example of critical thinking. He analyzed and brought to the surface a lot of the underlying deceit that was going on,
Yes.
the contradictions that was going on. He had a bigger platform, the whole nation. We have this platform, the Umoja Circle, but nonetheless, we must bring a call to conscience. We got less than a minute. We'll continue this because we'll deal more with what's going on today. We use Vietnam as a good example of why we still have some questions to ask about some of the policies that are going on to this day, and we must bring that because, you know, the balance of justice must be in favor of those who are voiceless, and we're going to express our voice. And until next time, peace. Hotep. Bye.